and cohesion in the European Union in general and in Central and Eastern Europe in particular. Let me thank that you're here and you decided to join us this morning, listen to our experts, and then to join our panel discussion as well. I also would like to thank the generous support, financial support of European Policy Center from Brussels. It was actually their help by which we could organize this event for today. Let me just quickly introduce the members of our workshop for today. We have Marzenna, Weresa, Professor of Economics from the Warsaw School of Economics. Hello. We have Jakša, Puljiz, the head of department for European politics, the Institute for Development and International Relations from Zagreb. And we have Tomáš Dudáš, Dean, Pan-European University from Bratislava. We also have a guest representing the European Policy Center from Brussels, Alison Hunter, Senior Advisor and Director. She'll be joining us online. Hello, Alison.
Hello.
I'm István Benczes, and I'll be moderating this event today. So, as you know, Hungary, with 7 other countries from the region, joined the European Union just 20 years ago, and we thought it would be a great opportunity to look back a bit to evaluate the progress they made. If you remember, 2004 was the year which has often been described as and referred to as the years of great moderation. So in the 90s and the early 2000s, hopes were really high, and for a good reason. The European project, the integration project, was well on track. EMU was successfully launched. The cohesion policy was pretty strong. So I think all of the countries from Central and Eastern Europe we joined by that time had a pretty good chance to converge and catch up relatively easily and quickly. And we also know that just 4 years later, in 2008, Latvia and Hungary were severely actually affected by the crisis, and later on Romania as well. And then in 2010, 2011 was about the debt crisis in Europe, where again several scholars and even laymen just, let's say, questioned the rationale of cohesion policy in the European Union, because it seemed that neither the eastern new member states nor the southern member states proved resilient enough to different kind of shocks. Then the 2010s proved again that the European Union as a project was rather massive. It reacted quite swiftly and coherently to the challenges by creating the European semester, by creating the banking union, and by now we have actually 20 member states just in the Eurozone. So I dare to say that by 2019, we all thought here, even in Hungary, that the convergence process should have been really a success story. And then again in 2020, another crisis hit Europe, and then in 2022, Russia attacked the Ukraine, and the geopolitical tensions plus the energy crisis again pushed this region at the brink. And accordingly, we might argue that the last 20 years, to some extent, has been a success story. Just think about, let's say, Romania and Bulgaria, which both started at roughly 1/3 of the average EU 27 GDP per capita in purchasing power parity, and by now they are somewhere around 2/3, so that's remarkable. Even here in Hungary, where we used to complain a lot, and still we are complaining a lot, we started somewhere below 60%, and we are quite close to 80%, and this 80-ish% is roughly kind of a trend line nowadays in this part of the world. Nevertheless, we somehow still not feel, let's say, satisfied enough. Some sort of a discontent, some sort of a fatigue, disillusionment prevails in that part of the world. Why is this the case? Is it because of purely domestic politics, misguided economic policies, or rather it was the EU and EU cohesion policy which has not addressed properly the challenges these countries actually had to face in the last 20 years. So this is the topic for our discussion for today. And I don't want to actually waste your time any longer. And I'd like to give the floor to our first presenter, Jakša Puljiz. So, Jakša, the floor is yours.
Thank you, István, and thank you for inviting me here, giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts about today's topic, so the cohesion policy and the convergence in the EU. But let me just briefly mention what you were saying about content and discontent. The case from Croatia, when you ask people, when you look at the results of the polls, when people are asked about how they see, the government running the country, how they see the institutions, and especially how they see the EU and the benefits from the EU. And always in the poll it's the same ranking. So the EU is very highly praised in the views of the Croatian citizens, much higher than the Croatian government or the government policy. So I think that at least for Croatia, we can say that the benefits coming from the EU are very much appreciated by the citizens. And now going back to the topic and the big picture. So luckily we have this year the 9th cohesion report out. So and it offers a wealth of data. So I just use some of those graphs to show you the situation on the regional level. We are talking about regional convergence, and of course we are all fully aware that regional convergence is really taking place. So this is a fact now. We can see the different kinds of time series, different kinds of data. The most important ones, which we usually use, the GDP per capita in PPS terms, and you can see obviously that there is a convergence when you look at the categorization of the region by cohesion policy. When you look at the situation with the less developed regions, you can see that there is a progress, so the red line. But also when you see geographically, and especially geographically, the Eastern European regions, you see actually even faster convergence. So convergence has occurred, and especially in the Eastern Europe. But we also see that some other parts of the Europe, notably the Southern Europe, which here consists the regions of the Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, they were not that successful, and we can see actually divergence in their case. What is also very interesting is when you look at the more granular picture and you go to the NUTS 3 level, so how it looks on the below NUTS 2 level, there's a very interesting graph which is related to this now famous concept of the development trap. So there was an attempt to measure the economic perspective at the below NUTS 2 level, as well as on the NUTS 2 level, and to see, okay, how are regions performing vis-a-vis their past performance, vis-a-vis their national average, and vis-a-vis the EU average. And then you can see there are a number, actually huge number of regions at the NUTS 3 level, which are stagnating or in decline. And where are they situated? Well, they're basically mainly situated in the more developed member states, mainly in France, in Italy. Of course, they can be found also in the Eastern Europe, in Croatia, in Romania specifically, in Greece as well. But this picture tells us that there is a problem. Obviously, there's a growth-related problem in large parts of Europe, and it relates to those middle-income regions. So how to ignite their growth? They have been for nearly 2 decades in some form of stagnation. And what we have witnessed when the researchers combined this data with their political vote patterns, there was a clear correlation that those regions have become more skeptic, more right-wing, in the sense more conservative in their political choice. So there is a very important lesson also from this map. So has this economic growth, remarkable economic growth, which was occurring, especially in Eastern Europe, transferred into the living standard? You can see here that these trends are very similar to the GDP trends. So indeed, there has been a translation of the growth in the improvement of the living standard, and this is the point. And this is why the quality of this growth was really very good. We can be satisfied with the quality of the growth. But we can also see that there are similar issues with other parts of Europe, with the southern part of Europe, as with the GDP growth. So we see a decline in the disposable income, which is not that big. It's a rather small decline, but still it's quite telling. So after 20 years have passed, we see that incomes are declining in large number of regions, mainly the middle income regions, but similar is also occurring with the high growth, high income regions. So there is a convergence process obviously happening. And one of the areas where the Eastern Europe has catch up fully with the most developed parts of the EU is the labor market. When we look at the employment rates, we see that basically the level of employment is pretty much the same in Eastern Europe and the Northwestern Europe. So this is not anymore the issue. The issue with the labor market, however, remains in the Southern Europe, in Spain especially, but also in many parts of Italy and Greece. This is still a problem. The poverty, the very important issue of the poverty, because we have seen the big problem with the poverty, which has occurred after the economic crisis in 2008, when the poverty rates went very much up, and it showed the fragility of our economic system. We see that after some time, so these are the data only from the 2016, but they clearly show that the poverty is again going down, and we can see also that the situation in the Eastern Europe is quite satisfactory. So it is basically similar to that, or slightly above the situation in the Northwestern Europe. The poverty is still much more present in the southern regions of the southern Europe. When you look, there is one particular data which I extracted, which is very telling, in my opinion. When you look which regions in Europe have the highest poverty rate and which have the lowest, both regions, the both ends are in Italy. So you see here, region Calabria, poverty rate of 48.6, which is astonishing. At the same time, the region with the lowest poverty or share person in risk of poverty is Bolzano, the northern Italy. So this is again telling us that internal disparities are still a great part of the story of the cohesion, and we can see how it is difficult to fight them. Now, one of the areas where the Eastern Europe was not so good was demography. So despite the huge economic progress, the improvement of the living standard, the demographic account is still negative. So we can see that Eastern regions have lost population. So this is only from 2010 to 2021. If it was from 2004, the result would be even worse for the Eastern Europe. While in the most developed parts of Europe, we see that there is demographic surplus, which is mainly coming from migration. But in some cases, there's even the positive natural population change in the northwestern regions of the Europe, and this is what we are missing in Eastern Europe. I'm coming from a country which is facing tremendous demographic challenges. I would say that at the moment, if you ask my government which is the problem number one in Croatia, they'll say demography. And demography is mainly related to the rural areas. What we have a huge problem are the rural areas. We see out-migration, we see further decline in the natural birth rate. But I mean, we should definitely see what is going on in the more developed areas of Europe, because in some of those areas, even the rural areas have rather satisfactory demographic results. So obviously there is a model which works, and we should learn more about it. And one other area where the Eastern Europe still has a lot to do is the quality of governance. So all the indicators on the quality of the governance show that there is still a huge gap between Eastern and Western, or to say Northwestern Europe. So a lot of work. There is one recent research has clearly connected the quality of the governance, for example, with the outcomes of the smart specialization strategies. So this was the case in Italy. And the finding was that around 40% of the potential impact on the GDP from the smart specialization strategy is lost in Italy because of the low quality of governance. So this is just another confirmation how this dimension is very important. I think it's going to be even more important in the time to come for the Eastern Europe, where the future growth will much more depend on the quality of the governance. And some other findings we just confirm, you know, the different aspects of the quality of the government, how they impact the economic growth. This is the relationship of the corruption with the constraints for the firm's activities. And of course, this correlation is much stronger in the less developed regions. So these are the main trends, the positive ones and the not so positive. And in conclusion, now going to the impact of the cohesion policy. What we would like to see is, okay, how beneficial was the cohesion policy and what was the impact of the cohesion policy in this? Now, this is very difficult exercise to establish, you know, straightforward answer. There are many attempts. They always have certain kind of limitations, but most of the most recent attempts to establish to see what is the impact and contribution of cohesion policy, the findings are positive. So they say basically, yes, cohesion policy has a positive effect, and it is lasting effect. It is lasting. And the more recent studies are, the most positive they are. Okay. So obviously there is, I would say, a contribution of the cohesion policy. Most of the analysis shows so. One specific aspect of the cohesion policy that I would like to emphasize is how it relates to the internal disparities, because internal disparities within the member states are on the rise. So there is a convergence at the level of the NUTS2, but at the same time, internal disparities are increasing. And here there is an estimation of the contribution of the cohesion policy to the decrease of the internal disparities, and it seems that in Hungary, it has the most favorable outcome. Now, of course, these are estimations. There's always some degree of error in that, but nevertheless, there is obviously a positive impact on the regional disparities, but it is not the same in all the countries. And some of the countries have seen a notable increase in the regional disparities, especially Bulgaria, Czechia, Croatia, and Romania. One other aspect of the cohesion policy that is necessary to take into account are the policy learning effects. I had a personal experience in administration. I worked for several years in the Ministry of Regional Development and EU Funds in Croatia. And I can also tell you many stories from the first hand how it positively affects the cohesion policy, domestic policy making. So it's a great policy learning tool. We have been introduced to many good practices in strategic planning, in evaluations, which we were not using before. The standards in project preparation, project monitoring, project evaluation were much improved due to the import of the policy solutions from the cohesion policy. There are some great policy innovations, I think, like smart specialization strategies, like integrated territorial investments. So these are kind of instruments which are novel to us, and I think they are really, really good ones. And of course, it's a great opportunity to learn from each other. There are many instruments which enable easy communication with your peers in other member states. You can see how the solutions are found in some other countries, and cohesion policy really supports that kind of learning from each other. So that's really beneficial. Now, coming to end of the presentation and looking forward to the post-2027 cohesion policy, I listed some risks about the cohesion policy. At the most general level, I think the cohesion policy is facing the risk of losing importance. So on the one hand, we could say, well, I mean, that's normal, given that there is a significant reduction in disparities. So maybe we should really reduce the importance of the cohesion policy because disparities are down, right? And well, maybe, but still disparities are significant. So they are significantly reduced, but they are still quite significant. And we have seen that in some parts of Europe, the problem is really also in stagnation. So there is still, I think, the case to continue with the important cohesion policy. Now, there's also the problem of the loss of the clear policy mission. So what should cohesion policy do? Should it respond to the crises which are becoming like everyday business? There's clearly a danger to neglect its long-term structural dimension. We have seen some ideas that some areas which cohesion has strongly supporting cohesion policy, like RDI policy, so research, development, and innovation, maybe should be taken to the and exclusively dealt from the EU level, like centralized. There's also a risk for the future that cohesion policy will not be that successful, given that we have now a majority of regions which are like middle-income regions, and to push the growth for middle-income regions seems to be quite more demanding than the low-income regions. Nationalization of cohesion policy, this is always a continuous topic. Should it be given more to the national level? And there's also the issue of the enlargement. If the enlargement occurs, obviously there will be a big impact on the budget, and in case that there is no additional funding, that would jeopardize, of course, the position of the existing lagging regions. And some open questions. I will not go through them because I have already taken too much of your time. Maybe leave it for the discussions. Basically, there are many open questions about the cohesion policy, and we will see that the time ahead of us is crucial. I really believe in this policy and its worth, but it doesn't mean that there are no really important risks which could be occurring and materializing in this area. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jakša. And then we agreed that in the first round, we go through each of the presentations. And after that, our distinguished guests can shortly reflect upon each other, and then a moderated discussion will follow. So Marzenna is our next presenter in the panel.
Excuse me. Yes, your presentation.
It's on the computer. Can we switch?
Yeah. If you have a pen drive.
But it is
It's on-
already there.
Yeah, he wants to, because he then mirrors it.
For Alison and the people on the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So should I?
Just
give her
maybe
somehow,
we have to
or-
put it in this computer too,
Yeah,
for the
Ah.
online.
because
because-
I will share your presentation for the online.
Okay, so I have it on the pen drive.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe in the lekváltsos videós.
See back at this,
Yeah.
2024. It's PowerPoint, but you can maybe change it to
Yeah.
PDF. Okay, thank you, Jakša, for an overview, because in fact, I do not have so many data. I just wanted to share with you my reflections on the topic, just illustrating with some data and some maybe some positive or negative cases. The task was difficult because the topic is very broad. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you for giving us such difficult task to cover convergence, competitiveness, innovation, and other important topics, also the role of funds and the role of support. A few reflections about convergence, competitiveness, and innovation. We forgot about competitiveness for a while, because it was really a hot topic in the beginning of the 21st century, but now competitiveness concept is experiencing some kind of renaissance, because we have many reports that have been published quite recently, Draghi reports, Letta reports, the report which I was also involved by the group of experts on European innovation policy headed by Catherine Richardson. So many reports that are discussing competitiveness, but competitiveness in the new perspective. I would like to share with you some key findings from these reports. Not all of them, because probably I would talk for ages to present all the findings. So what is the diagnosis of the EU competitiveness? First of all, LETTA report points out that the EU single market is lagging behind the US market. Secondly, we also see a wide gap between EU and US because of the slower productivity growth in the EU, which has been pointed out by Draghi. Thirdly, we also have to look at our competitors, China, not only the US, because China is becoming more and more important, in particular in the areas of digitalization, artificial intelligence. So we see the innovation divide in these areas between Europe and China. China is taking the lead or trying to take the lead. While we also see some strong innovation divide among member states and in particular among regions. And I would like to devote a few reflections on this issue as well, the latter one, the regional divide. When it comes to the assessment of catching up of new member states, just having more granular view on effectiveness and on the challenges ahead of us, we see mixed success. Poland is always discussed as a success story. Estonia, the same. Poland has own problems because it's a huge country, while Estonia, we see clear success story, which is driven by the EU reforms, EU funding, but also changes in what we lack much that we have seen in Jakša presentation, governance. Estonia now becomes a digital leader among the EU countries and also strong innovators. So we see advancement in terms of innovation performance. The latest European Innovation Scoreboard shows that Estonia moved from moderate innovators to strong innovators. Here we can there are also evidence that in fact Estonia used EU funds to strengthen its position. The problems, as we also have seen in this general picture presented by Jakša, are in Southern Europe. I would like to focus on southern countries from our region, so Romania and Bulgaria. We see disparities in terms of infrastructure, in terms of institutions, and also we see huge disparities across European countries when we look at innovation. So summing up the reflections on the catching up process and some success and some failures, we may say that key success factors are effective alignment to the EU funds and with national priorities, building stronger institutional framework, and in fact policy learning was, in my opinion, also I share your opinion that was a key factor in this process, or one of the key factors. Also the focus on education, the focus on R&D, the focus on digital transformation, on green transformation. That is something that Central European countries imported from the EU way of thinking and adapted to the necessity of these changes. But we still have some challenges related to inefficiency of fund allocation, administrative barriers, growing bureaucracy, and also disparities between urban and rural areas. So generally speaking, regional disparities. That is an example. There are many divides that we have seen in the previous presentation. The one that I would like to discuss is innovation divide. And here it's the regional innovation divide visible by colors. So disparities in regional performance, and we see significant gaps between leading regions and lagging regions, which translates into competitiveness at the end of the day. So there are huge disparities, huge gaps among European regions, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Southern Europe, Spain, for example, or some regions in France, or some regions in Italy are also lagging behind. we see some leading regions, like some regions in Denmark or Finland, and lagging regions, some regions in Romania, but also Eastern Europe. Why these gaps emerged? Because of the differences in research and development investment, differences in infrastructure investment, and also institutional factors that regions should develop. So generally speaking, structural factors were found in the literature as the primary drivers of innovation concentration and the most important reason behind the divide. So many studies proved that these structural factors are not really not easy to overcome. That is an example of these differences. For example, R&D expenditure as a percentage of the GDP, the first column, and the second column, EU fund absorption. It is from the data from the Eurostat and from studies on absorption of cohesion policy funds, the latest one. So as you see, Estonia and Poland are quite advanced in this process, and I pointed them out as a success stories, although Poland is not that much success story because we still have some challenges and problems, while Bulgaria and Romania are not that successful, both in terms of R&D expenditure and in terms of EU fund absorption. Of course, 89%, it's a good achievement, but still it's not 100% that, so having the money, they didn't use the money fully. What are the challenges? Where we can see the challenges regarding the narrowing the innovation divide, innovation gap. First of all, we see some innovation hubs where innovation emerges and some regions that are not able to advance. Why? Because the resources are limited, there are structural problems, and there are some historical barriers and differences. But the hubs are everywhere. This picture is taken from the report that I co-authored with many different people from Europe, available online. And you see that also the hubs are in the US. So the hubs exist everywhere. And also we see these hubs in Central and Eastern Europe. For example, artificial intelligence specializations have been found as a specialization in Bucharest or Budapest, like emerging hubs in these two countries. So hubs are everywhere. So we have to get used to hubs and innovation hubs, and there is nothing wrong with the innovation hubs. We cannot work to close the divide in this respect, because when we flatten innovation everywhere, it might mean that we cannot advance at all. But what we have to look at, we need to look for synergies between hubs and to link smaller ecosystems with bigger ecosystems to have this knowledge diffusion. So the idea is to make all regions benefit from innovation, not to make all regions to innovate in every area, because it's impossible, but to divide benefits of innovation to all regions. So one region specializing in biotechnology, other region specializing in artificial intelligence, of course, the third region maybe in ecological food, whatever, but we need innovation in all the areas, we need hubs in all areas, and we have to be aware that some areas are more profitable, the advantage of innovating might be higher than in other areas. So how to divide the benefits of innovation more or less equally, how to make all the regions benefit out of innovating in the hubs. So the conclusion is that every EU region should realize its potential and should play some role in the EU innovation system, but also should benefit from innovation that is produced in other regions. So how to divide benefits, that is the question. And here the EU funds might play some role to boost infrastructure, to boost education, to boost innovation. My personal way of thinking is that the key factor behind all the changes is education. because education, of course, education is something that when you invest, you can expect results after in the long run. So it's not very politically important goal in the sense that you cannot see effects during one political cycle. But my personal opinion is that education should come first, and investment in education should come first. And then, of course, other areas like governance, innovation, etc., should also be the important part of investment. But education is a key element. That is at least my personal opinion. Examples of the EU funds, how countries used EU funds. For example, Poland's transformation in energy, Poland's transformation in transportation, the infrastructure construction, that would not have been possible without cohesion funds. However, we still see some challenges regarding uneven distribution of the benefits. So that's the issue, how to make it more equal, or more how these benefits should be shared. Estonia, again, as a leader in terms of digital governance, in terms of building strong institutional frameworks, and in terms of investing in R&D, which contributed to Estonia's advancement in catching up in terms of innovation as well. So how to address innovation divide in the EU? Smart specialization to build on regional strengths. That is one way that should be considered. Connectivity between hubs and emerging ecosystems. Enabling technology development, which should be the goal everywhere in any region. And talent circulation to address somehow brain drain, because when innovation hub, when the place is not an innovation hub, it might experience the brain drain. So the issue is to address this problem. And education infrastructure regulatory reforms, that all the challenges that we have seen in the previous presentation should be addressed. A few words, I'm probably late with the presentation, but just a few words about RRP expenditures, because this money was in fact meant to advance in terms of climate change, in terms of digitalization. But as you see, comparing different countries, we may observe that different priorities were set by different countries. It's too early to say what was the role. That was the question that István asked us, but it's difficult to say what was the impact, or what is the impact, but at least we should consider that different countries see priorities differently, dividing this RRP funds among these two priorities, digitalization and green transition. A few words about Ukraine and enlargement. Of course, the war in Ukraine poses budgetary challenges, but we all understand that we have to support Ukraine in this war, and it is war not only Ukrainian war, but also our war, because we are fighting for democracy and for Europe, for united Europe, let's say it shortly. Future enlargement, I agree with Jakša that there are problems, and there might be the risk to lose the money for cohesion, at least for countries that are well advanced in catching up process. But other problems that should be pointed out are institutional readiness and cohesion of these new member states, if of course future enlargement appears. So and growing disparities again. So that is all from my side shortly, and I hope to discuss some issues later on when the questions appear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Tomáš, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Okay, so here all. I'm Tomáš Dudáš from Slovakia. Oh, it didn't go. Sorry. Okay, somehow I forgot to put my name into the presentation. I worked at HUN-REN University in Slovakia, and as I typically deal with the Slovak economy and foreign direct investments and economic cohesion and competitiveness in Slovakia, so I prepared my presentation from the Slovak perspective. So let's have a look at it. So to just frame the position of Slovakia, I just prepared data from the convergence of the 10 new CE member states between 2004 and 2023. I know Bulgaria and Romania joined a little bit later, but okay, just for the sake of it. So you can see that different countries had different results of the convergence, and they had different starting position. So yeah, there are two outliers. You see Czech Republic and Slovenia that's starting with more than 80% of the EU average, of course, GDP per capita in purchasing power parity. And then there is a group of countries that start around the 50, 60-ish, 60-ish level. That's where Slovakia is. We started with 59, Hungary started with 63, Poland with 51. And there are two, of course, other outliers, Romania and Bulgaria, that start with much lower level. So yeah, if you look at the results of Slovakia, well, they're not really remarkable. So we started, okay, there is a convergence, sure. So we started with 59% and ended with 73 20 years later. But if you look at the results of other countries, they are much more remarkable. For example, Poland, that starts with 51 and ends up with 80, Lithuania starting with 50 and ending up with 86. And of course, Romania, if you believe the data of Eurostat, Romania starts in 2004 with 35 and ends up with 80 in 2023. So it's really, really remarkable. So yeah, we didn't do that well in comparison with some of our fellow countries in Central Eastern Europe. And if you look at the data in the yearly perspective, you can see why. Because if you look at our 20 years of membership, we can roughly divide it into two time periods. There's first decade, it's going rather well. So you can see it started 59%, and eventually somewhere around in 2014, we reached 79%. So it's roughly 20 percentage points in a decade, which is fine. But then, of course, you can see that there is a decade of stagnation, and not only stagnation, but once again, if you believe the Eurostat data, not everyone believes in Slovakia. I mean, serious people. I have friends who work in the Analytics Policy Institute of the Ministry of Finance and some others in the National Bank of Slovakia, who are not completely content with the methodology and the data reporting. But still, even if you improve the data and the National Bank of Slovakia try to recalculate, it still remains around 78. So you can see that the stagnation is there. So something went wrong in the second decade of EU membership in Slovakia. Well, yeah, if you look at these two time periods, so the first decade, you can see the Tatra Tiger years, or the Tatra Tiger years are really even a shorter time period. So the Tatra Tiger years start, the high economic growth a year started before the EU membership, somewhere around 2002, and last until the global crisis of 2009. So that's where economic growth of 5, 7, 10% was normal. And you can see that, yeah, that was the driver behind the catch-up of Slovakia. And that was a drive behind the strong convergence. And of course, the main factor was the growth model that was based on large-scale greenfield FDI inflows, and mostly automotive industry. Some big OEMs came in, and of course, they brought with them the subcontracting network, which created a lot of course, new jobs and supported GDP growth. So, yeah, these years, this growth model was functioning very well. And of course, the government also did some interesting structural reforms. They simplified the tax systems, they lowered corporate government taxes, they improved the governance. So they made Slovakia a more interesting place for foreign investors. So things were going rather well until the global crisis. The global crisis is a breaking point where you can see that the convergence starts to slow down, and then it eventually stops somewhere around 2013, 2014. So something is really, really happening there. Yeah, what is really happening? So yeah, so after that there is really no convergence. There is a divergence. So 6 percentage points of divergence in the next decade. So yeah, the growth model based on the FDI is starting to show its limits. So there is only so many greenfield huge projects that you can cram into a small economy like Slovakia. So the inflow of the foreign direct investments slows down. So if, for example, if you look at the net FDI inflows as a percentage of GDP, you can see that really in the first decade of the 21st century, it goes rather well with the FDI inflows of being 2, sometimes 4, 6, 8% of GDP. But after that, after the global crisis, it slows down, and many times it doesn't even reach 2% of the GDP. So visibly less foreign direct investment is coming in. So the model starts to show its cracks, and yeah, the governments starts to suffer from let's say reform fatigue. So there is no really ambition to do structural reforms in the economy, you know, education or innovation or these kind of areas, which which is a problem in the long run, because you know you start to get stuck in the middle income trap, and the only way that leads you out of this leads through education and innovation. Yeah, you can say that in Slovakia we talk a lot about strategies and we write strategies. What is problematic is the implementation of the strategies. Or sometimes, or I think it happens also in other countries, that when a government changes, the old strategy is put away and the new government comes up with its own new strategy. Then the new government comes in and puts the other strategy away and starts up. So yeah, in education, in the last decade, I remember at least 3 broad strategies various governments proposed, and some of them were at least partially implemented. Okay, and of course, we can talk about also the utilization of the EU funds, the cohesion funds, and we will. And of course, in the last years, are, you know, the rolling crisis. We are rolling from one crisis to other crisis. First, there was the COVID-19 global pandemic. Then there was the war in Ukraine, which then led to inflation wave. Then there is a problem of Germany is not growing, and we are strongly connected to Germany. It's our main export partner. So yeah, in the last years, it's starting to get really problematic after 2020. We still, if you look at economic growth, there is still economic growth, but the economic growth after the global crisis is on average several percentage points lower than it was before the global crisis. and we were never able to replicate the numbers of the Tatra Tiger years. And if you look forward into the next years, the trend is visible that we will have this relatively low economic growth of 1.5 to 2.5%, which is not enough for serious cohesion, not cohesion, catching up with the EU. Okay, as for the role of the EU funds in this process, there is a role of these funds. Of course, Slovakia is a net recipient of EU funds, as typically Central European countries are. So we received, up until the end of 2022, more than 24 billion euros from the EU. And of course, the largest package of it is in cohesion funds. And the problem is, in the first years of the EU membership, the EU funds had a stimulating effect. Research shows that. But then what really happened is that we somehow get used to the EU funds and started to replace public investment with EU funds. And so the overall level of public investment didn't grow. So there was not a growth impulse from this. So what you can see it here in this graph. It's in Slovak, but it's very easily translatable. The blue is the domestic public investment, and the orange is EU funds. So you can see that gradually the domestic investment is decreasing, and it's substituted by EU funds in various degree. So this is a real problem. And of course, what is also a problem is for Slovakia is the utilization of the cohesion funds. We belong to the, let's say, less successful countries in utilization. I think we have an absorption rate around 90% or something like that, below the EU average, somewhat. Another problem is that we talk a lot about that the management of the EU funds is complicated and it costs a lot. So you have to employ a lot of people, and there is a lot of bureaucracy around it. And estimates say that the management of the EU funds costs per capita twice as much as in comparable countries. So that is also a problem. What is interesting, maybe, in regard of the slow absorption, is that when these crises started in COVID and the other crises, so Slovakia was suddenly in a good position because we were behind as usual in the EU fund absorption, and the EU enabled us to redirect some of these funds to deal with the crisis. So the EU let us put more than 1 billion euros into dealing with the economic effects of the COVID-19. EU also let us put more than 1 billion euros into the dampening of the energy price increases for the Slovak population, which is fine. But if you think about it, as it already has been mentioned, we are losing the long-term picture, because are these funds for this really? Yes, of course, it was important to deal with this crisis, but the cohesion funds are really originally not thought for this area. But yeah, that's how it went in Slovakia. Okay, and maybe I will show you one more graph. So you can see that once again the orange, this is a comparison of countries of the new EU member states. So you can see that it was not necessarily that EU funds substituted local funds. For example, if you look at Hungary, you can see the green line is an extra fund for investments, and also Poland. You can see there is all the countries that have big green areas, that means that the EU funds were an extra growth impulse, which increased the public investment. And you can see in the case of Slovakia, the green area is relatively small because there is this substitution effect that we were talking about, and that we just substituted some of the domestic public investment with EU funds. Okay, and yeah, there was also a question of inclusiveness, that how inclusive the convergence was in Slovakia. Well, if you look at the numbers between the capital and the other parts of Slovakia, well, it was not that successful. If you look at it, in 2001, Bratislava region was 112% of the EU average, and the other 7 regions were average 49%. And 20 years later, Bratislava was 149% of the EU average, and the regions were only 57% of the EU average. So that means that the economic convergence was not really inclusive, but this is the main factor is the foreign direct investment behind this, that the uneven distribution of FDI. So the largest quantity of FDI goes into the western part, or went into the western part of the country, and Bratislava region has an unevenly high share of FDI inflows, which of course contributes to the growing GDP per capita. But of course, capitals typically stick out from the national average. And the good news is that the EU funds were dampening this process. So they, the Bratislava region is excluded, of course, from most of the cohesion funds, and so the EU funds flow into the other seven regions of Slovakia. So they contributed to somewhat evening the field between the regions. Okay, yeah. On the other hand, maybe this looks bad, that the distance between Bratislava and the other regions grew, but if you look at some social quality of life indicators, then the difference is not so bad between. So really, you can debate whether the difference between Bratislava and the rest of the other regions is really that deep. Yeah. So what to say at the end? Well. So as you can see that the catching up process produced mixed results in the last 20 years of the membership in the EU. But we have to say that really the EU membership is a positive effect, and the EU funds are a positive effect. I also took part in a debate with some Slovak experts who said that echoed the same sentiment, that the EU membership and the EU funds and the cohesion policies, taught us a lot about modern policy making. So without that, policy making in Slovakia would be much less competentful. So we absorbed a lot of knowledge from being 20 years in the European Union, and yeah. And to close it up, just to reflect upon that's how positive membership is viewed in Poland. Interestingly, Slovakia is a much more skeptical country nowadays. One of the last Eurobarometers, I think the 98th, there is only roughly 1/3 of the Slovaks view EU positively. 1/3 views it neutrally, and 1/3 views it negatively. And which is maybe much more disturbing, that 31% of the respondents say that maybe Slovakia would face future challenges better outside the European Union. So that's in my eyes, it's really disturbing percentage of people, because personally, I don't see any kind of real future for Slovakia outside the EU. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we have excellent presentations, and now we move on to our online here with Alison Hunter. Alison will be joining us from Brussels.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. And do you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet, but we will.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, we
Yes.
do see it now.
it's there. Okay, good. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to join you this morning. As has been said, I'm representing the European Policy Centre, where I'm a policy analyst, and I work on cohesion policy and in particular regional innovation and smart specialisation, which has already come up this morning. So interesting to follow up on that too. My intervention is going to look at EU convergence and competitiveness from the perspective of what influences performance and the extent to which these objectives of competitiveness and convergence are actually achievable going forward in a vastly changed EU operating environment. The challenges that regions are facing today are much more wide-ranging than economic performance, which of course the convergence objective is often reduced to. And the 9th cohesion report, which has already been mentioned this morning, refers to regions having multiple development needs. And indeed, a more recent focus on EU regional data shows regions with historically strong performance falling into development traps. This has already been noted with stagnating economies. Some territories bear the brunt of climate change impacts related to, for example, heat or flooding. So I think overall, we know the territorial characteristics of all regions matter, because they tell us that highly tailored responses are needed to support their needs, especially as we look to a rapidly changing EU and global context. And this, of course, is the case for Central and Eastern European regions too. In understanding regional performance, we are also thankfully shifting away from national level data that often masks what's really happening at the regional level. And again, the 9th cohesion report tells us that about a third of EU regions have yet to see a return to 2008 levels of GDP per head. So today's geopolitical context and crisis era is challenging us to consider whether we're using the most relevant metrics to understand EU regions' needs, because if we fail to do this, we fail to support them to prepare for a changing future. And I would argue that convergence is not a sufficiently useful proxy for either measuring or understanding the effectiveness of cohesion policy, or for helping to design new policy and investment responses for what regions actually need today. This slide here talks a bit about paradox, because on the one hand, we have this enduring objective of convergence, but it remains elusive for many of our most challenged places. The second point on this slide is about regional non-convergence, and when we compare that to the EU average and of course to national performance, we see lots of challenges, and these challenges are also in Hungary and in Poland, as well as Slovakia, Bulgaria and Romania. And for citizens in places left behind, this creates interpersonal inequalities based on a perceived lack of fairness and opportunity. And it's interesting to hear what was said by the last speaker about, do Slovakian citizens feel they have a future within the EU? This notion of fairness and opportunity matters enormously, because there are, of course, social and political implications with regard to populism, swing to the far right, and of course, anti-EU rhetoric. Also in this slide, I want to really point out that we have made significant leaps at the EU level in improving data And with that, we do have a more nuanced picture of the characteristics that influence disadvantage, which we've already been talking about today, like long-term stagnation and development traps, and even talent development traps. But actually, we still have very limited EU responses and policy solutions to address these challenges. And this kind of inertia has created a very high level of frustration, and it has provided an excuse within some member states at the national level, and I would call them the cohesion policy skeptics, to call for a radical overhaul of cohesion policy with much more limited financing. And these are what we might call the frugal member states, who have a waning appetite to continue to finance cohesion in the traditional way. But indeed, we know that money alone does not deliver on the convergence conditions. The other point I'd like to raise here is about, and it's been noted already, that the crisis era in the past did not help with convergence, but we are in a new crisis era that is connected to climate, geopolitics, war, and international relations, and this is putting an incredible level of pressure on our least advantaged regions in particular. Cohesion's convergence objective will continue to face a very steep climb, because the conditions to achieve convergence are not present in all places. And this is still vastly under-acknowledged, and it's often even ignored in some member state capitals. And it has contributed to cohesion's unfair reputation as a failed policy in generating convergence. And indeed, the high-level group reporting on the future of cohesion policy earlier this year said cohesion is far too important to be left to cohesion policy alone. So issues like weak governance, space-blind policymaking, and absence of connected policy responses within member states have contributed to the convergence challenge, and this is often under-acknowledged. This slide here is really one that asks the question, are the EU's main budget tools really redistributive? So the visual shows that for the blue category, those are member states below 75% of the average EU GDP. Less than half of the funding connected to cohesion policy is targeted to these countries. And the same with CAP and with the Recovery and Resilience Fund, where it's approximately a quarter of the financing that is targeted at these countries. So the question this really begs is EU financing really targeting the least economically advantaged territories? And if it's not, EU policies are not doing what they claim to do, and that is due to insufficient targeting. This slide here is one that I've borrowed from a paper that I wrote recently, which is really about the EU's eroding interest in place-based policymaking, which I find rather risky, actually, particularly for our least developed places and for many places in Central and Eastern Europe. In an era of radically changing EU policy, the rhetoric at both EU Council level and within the Commission is consistently focused on national and EU 27 responses to the challenges that we face. So by default and design, this points to diminishing commitment to a place-driven and territorially targeted EU policy direction. Now, there are many reasons for this, and I've indicated some of these on these two circles here, but just to take a couple of them. The game-changing top-down dynamics of the Recovery and Resilience Facility that member states are extremely wedded to in their efforts to increase control over EU financing has meant that the radically altered geopolitical context that we have too, especially with respect to international trading relations, war and conflict. And that, of course, gives rise to top-down decision-making related to security and defence, industrial policy, and an increased focus on instruments such as the important projects of common European interest, the IPCES, which are mainly driven at the national level. So why does this matter? Well, centralised decision-making risks dislocating the regions from the EU's direction of travel, and that's going to make it more difficult for EU regions to take a proactive stance in determining the EU's future and making the case for their territorial needs, and in turn that might reduce how regions actually are able to engage with EU policy in terms of interaction with institutions, with their national capitals, and even with each other. And on this slide, I'm really pointing to tough choices that I don't believe are being obviously acknowledged in the debate about the future, the post-27 EU budget, and with respect to cohesion policy. The Draghi report has already been mentioned. It's highlighted a shortfall of 800 billion euros per year to finance our competitiveness deficit. We are hearing a great deal now about a new competitiveness fund, which is a compelling rationale about expanding tools and investments to drive new and clean technologies, for example. But in a fiscally constrained context, how are we able to finance both competitiveness and convergence? In an environment of new spending needs, how can the EU afford to accommodate its pre-existing ones? And at political levels, this is clearly an extremely sensitive topic, and there's been a lot of ambiguous rhetoric behind it. But now we have our commissioners confirmed. The real debate will begin across the EU27 about our future financing needs. And I would argue that within that, we need a much more honest narrative about the trade-offs that we're facing into. And with this, I would point to the EU's growth agglomeration model, where it's much easier to shore up successes in more developed regions than it is to address the challenges in less advantaged and less developed regions. And if we're looking ahead, new EU priorities and fiscal constraints to finance existing ones will have a significant impact on the already uneven development of EU territories. So what do we know so far about the future cohesion policy? Well, it's going to have a much stronger reform orientation, and it's very likely to be underpinned by performance-based budgeting through this also simplification agenda. But if we look at what do we mean by a reform agenda, some of these mini bullet points under point 4 are things that we know a great deal about already. Take public administration. This is based on political trust and government quality, and we now have a great deal of very compelling evidence that these have an enormous impact on economic development. Also, the last point, and it's been mentioned so far about innovation externalities or innovation spillovers. Actually, the performance in the EU is that that's very limited. Even in territories that are next to high-performing agglomerated regions, distance decay is a very strong feature in the EU. And it's creating concentrated innovation performance, which has already been mentioned, in Northern and Western Europe. And this also creates closed club effects. Now, added to that challenge, we have a very significant innovation diffusion challenge. And I would argue, and we can come back to this, this is not merely about bringing less developed and more developed regions closer together with the hope that innovation diffusion becomes transferred. It is much deeper challenge than this, where there are structural challenges and, of course, incentives for the continuation of the model that we see now. We might expect the new cohesion policy to promote the reforms that I've just mentioned very strongly, but we're not operating within a level playing field. The ability to meet these conditions is very highly differentiated, depending on a wide range of place-based factors. And will that high level of differentiation be better acknowledged in the future cohesion policy? I certainly hope so, because if not, we're going to continue to face the same challenges with respect to disparities and inequalities. I'd also like to talk a little bit on this slide about the divides that have already been mentioned, innovation divide, digital divide, but we are actually now facing into a green divide, and it will be very, very challenging to avoid that green divide, because the green transition requires complex solutions with long-term investments for infrastructure, technology, admin capacity, skills, expertise, and know-how that are not always available in our least developed, most vulnerable places, and indeed also in many rural places of the EU. And that is also related to brain drain, which has already been mentioned. So financing the EU's new priorities without sufficient cushioning for our least advantaged places could actually exacerbate inequalities. And we have a great deal of evidence now that left behind places are good predictors of support for right-wing populist parties. And of course, that's already been noted today. So what are the solutions to the challenges that we're facing? I would say where we are right now is we're at something of an impasse because we have a mismatch between new EU priorities and the financial capacity to pay for these and our existing ones. And that includes the demands that are being placed on the future cohesion policy, not least by the cohesion community, which are advocating for very similar conditions around the cohesion policy that are in place now. But these are at odds with new EU demands. And my personal view is that something's going to have to give and trade-offs are going to have to be made. So how are we going to be able to ensure that cohesion doesn't become dislocated from the EU's direction of travel? And with this, I refer a little bit in my previous slide, and I'll come back to this, to a paper that I wrote earlier this year, which is an attempt to bring the debate about the future cohesion policy closer to the EU's direction of travel with respect to defence and security agenda. So just to go into that in a little bit of detail to explain some of what I mean there. My view is that cohesion could be much better aligned with our new EU priorities, with a stronger focus on resilience and security, because cohesion is the traditional EU policy launchpad for regions to access wider EU opportunities. So reforming the policy into something that is a security and resilience direction could help to keep the regions closer to the EU's direction of travel. So what exactly do I mean by resilience and by security in this context? Well, resilience is a very, very broad concept, and it was picked up very recently by the Niinisto report just a few weeks ago, former Finnish president, who wrote a huge report on what the future resilience needs of the EU look like. And this is very relevant to our EU regions because it is about demography. And actually, we have a great deal of evidence that every place across Europe is facing demographic trends. It's actually the US that is less susceptible to the challenges that we are facing in Europe right now. And of course, in the transition agenda, the impacts of global threats with respect to war, trade and economic security. And also we need resilience, more resilience in strengthening institutional quality to manage social and political unrest, to address threats to democracy and of course the EU rule of law. So we're seeing a changing definition of what we mean by resilience at the EU level, but yet to see that being attached sufficiently well to the cohesion policy agenda. And on the other side of security, by security, I don't just mean from a defence perspective. We need to start thinking more about security from its broadest dimension. So food security, climate security, of course, defence is there, cyber, an incredibly important one, and our skills security. And we're seeing more and more of the direction and the narrative about the future EU financing under dual-use technologies. And I think this is going to be something that's incredibly important for regions, because these dual-use technologies, of course, from a security and defence perspective, will also be the very things that will help us to drive transitions with respect to, for example, green mobility and infrastructure. So I think these are some of the issues that I think we have to be looking forward into to address the solutions that we find, because I do not believe that we will have a cohesion policy in the future that will be readily able to address our very long-term convergence challenges. So I actually wonder if we should be shifting from convergence to resilience and what it is that our regions will need to look to in the future. I'm going to stop there. And say thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to the remainder of the discussion. Thank you very much.
As well, but since we are well ahead of the planned, let's say, time, let me just first ask our distinguished speakers and guests if they wish to respond to each other's presentations. So if you would like to comment on what you just heard. in this first round? Any of you?
I don't know. Maybe just give.
Yeah, Tomáš, go ahead.
No, just maybe just let's give space to your questions or the
Okay.
audience questions.
That's fine as well. So then, maybe I be the first one, because certainly, you all, each of you, demonstrated that there has been, let's say, tremendous, a magnificent catching up process in this area, and with some outliers, of course, such as Romania and Bulgaria on the positive side, whereas, let's say, Slovenia on the other hand. Definitely in this sense, convergence has been a success story. But each of you quite demonstratively emphasized that it has happened parallelly with the deterioration in institutional quality and probably even in competitiveness. So whereas in GDP terms, we are okay. If we look at any of the major institutes such as the World Bank or the European Commission or OECD's different sorts of competitiveness indicators, we see that this part of the world has actually deteriorated a lot. And except for Estonia, Marzenna, you made reference to the innovation scoreboard, for instance, except for Estonia and to some extent the Czech Republic, these countries did not manage to actually to grab the first positions in any of these rankings. So don't you feel some sort of a tension here that on the one hand, when growth was more about an extensive thing, we were quite successful, but now, as Jakša described it, as now we are approaching this middle income trap, or possibly we are in this trap already, it's pretty hard to get rid of it. So how this competitiveness issue, how the slow productivity issue could be somehow remedied all with the tools of cohesion policy, or perhaps cohesion policy doesn't have to fix this at all because it has not been invented for that. What do you think?
If I can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, first we have to understand the limits of the cohesion policy. So the cohesion policy, can do a lot of things, but it cannot do everything. It certainly cannot, guarantee you the, overall economic growth and success, simply because it has the limits in the resources, also in the types of the policy instruments. We are fully aware that, long-term growth you cannot sustain without reforms, without changing the society, the way how we, act, in how we do the policy making, how we make hard choices, and so on. That the investment and cohesion policy is, pure investment policy per se cannot solve the problem. When you look at the type of the investments funded by the cohesion policy, it's still mainly the hard, typical, old-fashioned infrastructure in transport, in environment, the kinds of infrastructure which is necessary, but which doesn't guarantee the long-term success. When you look how much we have invested into the innovation and what were the outcomes of those investments, then we see much smaller results. So obviously that there is something in the policy mix and the policy choice of the cohesion policy. And now I think that there is a time when we will have to be more demanding from the less developed regions, less developed countries in terms of what kind of policy mix are we funding with the cohesion policy. And much more emphasis, in my opinion, should be given to those long-term factors like research, innovation, investments. For example, in Croatia, when I look how did we proceed to the area of innovation, what we have financed over the last 10 years, well, mainly it was still hard infrastructure. We purchased a lot of equipment, we constructed a lot of buildings, but now it takes much more to have results of those outcomes. So what we need now is actually a long, sustained period of funding the R&D, indeed R&D, and you need a policy environment. So we have to create the decent policy environment, and this is not something that cohesion policy can do per se. So for me, the right combination, what we have seen in the resilience and the recovery facility, this combination of the investments and the reform, if it is designed properly and if it is executed properly, that could create the necessary change that we need and the impetus for further convergence in the future.
Thank you very much. Marzenna, please.
I would like to come back to the Alison's statement that cohesion alone cannot deliver convergence, and it also cannot deliver competitiveness. So, building on what Jakša said, cohesion policy cannot build everything. So we need to somehow refine what we expect and what other regions need in terms of convergence. So we need to identify the areas where convergence is needed. So this digital divide, or let's say talent divide, or green divide. How to compensate for these divides, how to avoid big divides. But we also, in my opinion, have to accept that some divides will remain. So we need to figure out what is the level of this acceptable, let's say, divides within regions. What worries me it's the opinion of people, what has been said about Slovakia, that 1/3 is for the EU, 1/3 do not have an opinion, and 1/3 of the population are against. So again, I think that the role of the policies is not only to provide financing, but also educate people, not just showing evidence that we built these buildings thanks to the EU money, but to make people understand what is the real contribution of the EU, not only in terms of building, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of the free flow of ideas. We have an access to bigger market for goods, services, people, but also ideas. We have unrestricted flow of ideas. We have flow of students from one country to another. So all these elements should be somehow marketed, because without people's support in individual countries, we cannot have any policy working. People should be involved. So the question is how to make people involved to make use of the money that they have. Because I see some institutional limits, but I also see some limits related to the mindset. So the question is how to change people's mindset to make people understand that the real benefits are in fact low-hanging fruits, because the money is there, at least was there in the previous perspective. That's all from my side.
I totally agree. Thank you, Marzenna, Tomáš.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to add that in context of convergence, what really happened is that we gathered all the low-hanging fruits of economic growth and economic development, which was the easy part to do. But yes, as it's already been mentioned, so the next level is the complicated level that we have to make hard choices, and of course it leads to innovation and education. And yes, if you look at the innovation scorecard, most of our countries, regions are moderate, or what is the last group? Emerging or the innovators. So there is clearly a divide between the old EU's member states and the new member states. And as for the EU cohesion funds, also in Slovakia we have the same. I think it was the same situation, that the governments, the most easy way was to, as we say it in Slovakia, to pour the money into concrete. So yeah, hard infrastructure projects. They are big, they are relatively easy to manage, railways, highways. And also, if the money went into education, it was mostly about buildings and stuff. So yeah, we reconstructed the school buildings, which was nice because there is an okay investment deficit in this area also, and built the universities, built some new science parks or whatever. But the problem is that the content. So yeah, the university has a very nice new science park, but what is it doing there? Are they doing some really internationally compatible research there in this new science park? And the problem is always that these projects that go into innovation are typically smaller, and it takes up more administration, and yeah, and the results are mixed, because sometimes I don't know how it is in other countries, but in Slovakia sometimes you know that there come the problematic sides that I don't know how much money was poured into this project and the results were like non-existent. Or sometimes it's just fraud. It has been unearthed that some of the innovation projects were outright fraud. So it's quite hard to do that. But I think the Slovak government is in for a rude awakening, and maybe other governments too, because the cohesion policy will change, as Alison said. It will change, and it will be less about the hard infrastructure projects, and it will be more about digital transition and green transition, as it has been already in the resilience fund, where you could see that Slovakia, I think your presentation had it, the goal, where the thresholds for digitalization and green transition. Slovakia barely made the digitalization. I know it was very hard for us to at least make the 20% for digitalization into it, but I think this is the way forward. I think that the model that the resilience fund introduced is quite good. So the countries have to deliver to get, or this is one way forward, maybe.
Thank you so much.
Could I maybe add a couple of points?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I think the fundamental question for me is, when we look to the future of cohesion policy, what is it for? And who is it for? And we are seeing a narrative that is increasingly indicating that it is going to be mainly dedicated to the less developed regions. It's going to have a much smaller budget behind it, and it's going to be dedicated more towards this convergence objective. And yes, I agree with that. Under that will be also transition objectives very clearly. But that's going to require extremely tailored treatments in each of these places, because they have very different challenges, and those challenges require very targeted responses. With that, also the performance-based budgeting that we're facing into, the question about that, it tends to favour more predictable financing. So the innovation-oriented, the more experimental financing that cohesion has targeted in the past, although not to the same extent, I think we're going to see a lot less of that. And in any case, there will be less budget dedicated to it. But I think, going back to your question about the competitiveness objective through cohesion policy, what we will have to see there, and I do not see a guarantee of this emerging, is real structural alignment between cohesion policy and other competitiveness-oriented funds. So take the new competitiveness fund, however it looks, what will be its entry points? Who will be able to access it? How will you be able to align financing behind it? So this comes back to questions of governance at the EU, at the national, and of course at the local level, and of course simplification, because if it's too difficult to access this kind of financing and connect it to rather more limited support sources of cohesion, that will be incredibly difficult. But another and final point I would end on there is, we're often told, and I work in this area a lot, particularly at the very local level, that smart specialisation has been a success story for cohesion policy in I suppose trying to design a new way of working around innovation and competitiveness. But smart specialisation sits alone. It does not sit with and does not create synergies. Very rarely is it able to do that under the framework programme, and it certainly doesn't across other policy areas. So we see that what smart specialisation is delivering, either at the regional level or even interregionally, is not being connected to any EU innovation pipeline, and that has been a significant failing in how we structure innovation policy at the EU level and, of course, at the national level too. So I think we would have to see a significant change in how we think about those kinds of instruments under cohesion and their connectivity and that launchpad that I mentioned earlier into accessing other EU opportunities that are much more strongly connected to competitiveness and innovation.
Anyone in the room before lunch? Or certainly, Andrea, please go ahead.
Two
Yes.
short questions. One to Jakša. How Croatia is looking from the point of view of regional disparities? Do you have huge regional disparities, or the country is more or less quite unique in that respect? I mean, not so heterogeneous like Poland or other countries. And to Tomáš, another question that you showed us the stagnation period of the second phase of Slovakian history. So what comes now? What is the future according to you? How the government is prepared to change things, or is it not prepared? Thanks.
As for Croatia, well, if you look on the NUTS-3 level, since Croatia is quite small, it only makes sense to look at the NUTS-3 level or even below. Then it has quite impressive disparities for such a small country. If you recall the map with the development trap index, a couple of those most trapped regions on NUTS-3 level are actually located in Croatia. So the most problematic areas are along the border with Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's very difficult there to achieve some meaningful results. First of all, they are demographically like almost empty areas, so it's very hard to initiate any kind of a complex set of activities there, simply because there is no capacities. If you want to invest in those areas, sometimes it's only the question of the capacity of the labor market to provide, you know, the necessary workforce. So yes, we have a lot of problems, but we are also trying somehow to address them. And when you look the policy approach of the cohesion policy programs in Croatia, you can see that there is a strong regional dimension. So we are always trying to, you know, when you plan interventions, okay, make a special approach to those least developed areas in Croatia. Find some, you know, special tool or special incentive for those areas. And now we have even created this special program, which is only about less developed areas in Croatia. So I cannot say the government is not trying, but change these relations between low developed and more developed areas in Croatia is a very, very difficult job. Like everywhere, I would say.
Oh, yeah, the short answer, it's not prepared. Unfortunately, yeah, what we're seeing is that that as the government still continues in the growth model based on foreign direct investments. So still some more greenfield investments are coming in. So there is a new factory that is being built, a Volvo car manufacturing factory, which will be the 5th in Slovakia, and Goshen battery factory is being built in Suran. So I think that the government is still stuck in this FDI based growth model, but clearly there are limitations. But yes, some parts of the government realize some of the biggest structural problems. I think the Ministry of Education realizes that one of the biggest problems Slovakia facing is a brain drain. Which starts with that Slovakia, I don't know whether you know, probably not, Slovakia has the highest share of university students studying abroad, like 20% every year. It's because mostly of Czech Republic, because the languages are similar. So yeah. So how do we stop the brain drain, or how do we motivate the people, young people coming back to Slovakia after the education, the university studies in Slovakia? So there are initiatives, programs that the Ministry of Education is trying to do in this regard. And there are also policies for improving education. There are projects. I was in a project about finding local unicorns, the high-tech companies with a valuation of $1 billion, how to build a unicorn in Slovakia, in a very improbable way, let's say that. But the problem is that what I see is the problem that the overall what's the word for it? Overall mood in the country is not very good. So with this, it's very hard to motivate the young people to come back to Slovakia and to not to pursue a life career outside of Slovakia, which is really a pity, because those 20%, the 20% are the best, the most motivated students, of course, that are leaving the country. And maybe I would add to the how to inform the people about the successes of the EU. The government tries to do that. There are campaigns to talk about what all the EU brings us, but the problem is that there are actors who are spreading disinformation and misinformation about the EU through social networks, and it's very hard to counter that, especially if the current government is also not a really big fan of the European Union as such. If sometimes hear our Prime Minister talking about the EU, so it's not really helpful about building confidence about the European Union.
But the key issue is to make people understand that EU is us. It's not just EU somewhere. We are the EU.
Yes, but there are actors who are spreading the narrative that that's Brussels and that's us. And Brussels.
So how to change the people?
Yeah, it's a really huge issue.
Thank you very much. Vivian, go ahead, please, and probably the last question. Okay.
Yeah, to Jakša, please, I would like to ask, what did you mean under nationalization of cohesion policy? And to Alison Hunter, I would ask if there were already some changes in cohesion policy by building in the vocabulary of this whole policy box, the competitiveness and resilience after 2008-2010 crisis. And today, this new changement is just that the security comes in, or there were not substantial changes after the 2008 world crisis in the cohesion policy at all. And now we are going through that. So we're under any other phases of this policy box, basically.
Thank you, Vivian.
Nationalization, well, basically it means that everything would be decided on the national level. The cohesion policy would not be designed in a way as a shared management, meaning that there are some common goals, there are some common approaches, but basically the nationalization would lead to the situation where the member states get the money and they decide solely what will be the priority, where they will invest, and the rules of the game would be totally national. There would be no need to respect some kind of, let's say, EU principles or implementation of the cohesion policy.
So it's a different future than what Alison Hunter just said, that it will be more top-down. And just say, according to your insights,
well,
it will be more bottom-up.
Top-down refers mainly to the new instruments which are now on the table, like this European Competitiveness Fund, new central instruments which are outside of the cohesion policy, but they are, targeting basically very similar areas which cohesion policy is also funding. So we could have, let's say now, multiple instruments, but with different approaches.
Thank you, Jakša. Thank you. Alison?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the question well, but let me say what I thought it was, and if it isn't, then please do let me know. With respect to the design of future cohesion policy, we are hearing a lot about a single national plan, and that's not just for cohesion. That would be bringing together things like CAP and cohesion. And so in my personal view, we are looking into a very strongly centralised, nationally driven policy. And it's not clear at all how that will, or if it will, include regional chapters. And this is also about the legacy of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which has adopted this highly nationally driven, centralised approach. And we know for sure that that has not targeted well the local needs of regions across the member states. There's been some attempt to do it in Italy, perhaps more than in some of the other places, but it's not really clear. Yes, the evidence is not out yet because it's still too new, but the process leaves an awful lot to be desired. The process has had many gaps in it, and the European Court of Auditors has been extremely critical of that. I think the question was really about, has there been and will we continue to see more change in cohesion's objectives going forward? Is that right? Is that what the question was?
It was more like retrospective, because I thought that after the 2008 crisis, there were already huge changes in cohesion policy, but it was not clear if we are just continuing that or there are new terms now.
Yeah. Never underestimate the inertia in the EU policy-making toolkit. It's very same at the national level. It's very difficult to change the direction of policies. And what we've done in cohesion is we've just added more to them. We've not really taken anything away. So we've diluted what the policy is intended to do, and we've diluted how we're targeting the policy's direction. But will there be a wake-up call with respect to how cohesion should change in the future, particularly to address those least advantaged places, and not just because of their anti-EU rhetoric, but frankly because within the European Union, we have a moral obligation to address the challenges that exist there. But I am not confident that we're facing into a future. I think that the fight is going to be very, very challenging between the member states from the Central and Eastern Europe and those more frugal member states. It will end up being the usual horse trading about, if I give you this, what will you give me in return? Which is why I think that if we put something on the table about what Europe needs going forward, we can talk about convergence. And of course, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the convergence objective, but how relevant is it when we are looking at a context of seeking to build resilience in our most vulnerable places? Because we know that even improved economic performance does not necessarily mean that places are actually resilient to multiple threats. So we have to look at it from a much broader context. And I would personally welcome if we don't ignore the convergence objective, but we take into account the kinds of issues that these places are facing, and that they are not purely about economic convergence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, our audience as well, for joining us today. And the lunch is just waiting for all of us outside. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure. Yeah, it's very interesting.